Well, welcome everyone. I am very excited to be here today with Nora Gold, editor of Jewish Fiction Journal. I always want to say jewishfiction.net, but I think it's changed now to Jewish Fiction Journal. So welcome and welcome to everybody else. And as always, any questions you have, go ahead and type them into the chat and I will work them into the conversation. So Nora is joining us from Toronto, and why don't you tell us the origin of the magazine, when it started, why it started?
Sure. Well, it's sort of a funny story because we so take for granted the digital world and digital publishing. But in 2010, when I thought of starting this journal, it happened because the advent of digital publishing was a terrible threat and challenge to the publishing industry, the print publishing industry, and that had an immediate effect on Jewish writers.
Hmm.
I knew someone personally who was a very good writer and just couldn't get her book published anywhere because the traditional publishers were doubling down. They were afraid they'd go under. They saw Jewish fiction as niche fiction. And this person told me an anecdote about one publisher saying to her, just put your novel in a drawer. In 10 years, this will all be over and we'll look at it again. Well, first of all, that wasn't true. Digital publishing is not over 10 years later, and it's not going to be. But she said, I'm just going to stop writing. If I can't find a publisher, forget it. So I thought this is a terrible thing. I don't want all this great literature being lost. She was not at all alone. I was hearing this from a lot of people, and I thought, well, let me just create a space where people can publish Jewish fiction. I never thought it would last for 15 years, and it's going to last hopefully much longer.
Mhm.
Right from the beginning, it filled a gap because there was no journal like this at the time. At the time, there was no print or online journal devoted exclusively to Jewish fiction, and that's still the case. We were the first, and we're still the only. And a lot of people came on board right away. Very, very impressive and exciting people formed an advisory council. Almost immediately had this amazing team of reviewers and editors, people with PhDs and writers, literary people with tremendous backgrounds and skills. So even from the beginning, even though I started it and I'm still the editor in chief, it really has been a communal effort. I'm could never do this without all these people.
Mhm.
I'm forever indebted. And everyone is a volunteer, me included. So it's a true labor of love.
Mhm.
There was another agenda, which I understood only in retrospect, as clearly as I do now, and that has to do with the multilingualism of Jewish fiction. Most people, when they hear the term Jewish fiction, they think about, if their first language is English, they think about Jewish fiction in English only. Generally speaking, they think of American Jewish fiction. They might know about Yiddish or Ladino or Judeo-Spanish, as it's also known. They may know some Hebrew translations, but generally speaking, people aren't aware of what's out there. And because Jews for 2,000 years have lived in almost every country in the world,
Mhm.
Jewish fiction has been written in virtually every language where Jews have lived. So it's an incredibly multilingual and multicultural body of literature. And I kept meeting people who didn't know that. And in fact, throughout the life of our journal to date, I'm constantly getting emails from people who say, oh, I didn't know there was Albanian Jewish literature,
Mhm.
Serbian Jewish literature, Greek Jewish, et cetera, et cetera. So it became very important to me to help educate in that sense. And it was also just a joy for me to discover all this stuff as I went along.
Mhm. So, how did you find your advisory board? Were these people that you already knew, or did they come to you? And what is your editorial staff currently? Is it just you, or do you have a team of editors?
Mhm. I have something of a network because I'm a writer as
Mhm.
well. In fact, I'm primarily a writer who's had two books out this year, and one of them is actually the product of this journal.
Hmm.
It came out a year ago. It's called 18, um, 18 Jewish Stories translated from 18 languages, and these are all stories that we first published. Um, some of these people I knew but not well. They were the sorts of people whose names I knew. And sometimes it was someone who knew someone, but it was like a magnet. I mean, I think that's what happens when something is needed. And then suddenly, oh, it's there. I want to be part of this.
Mm.
My team has always been about 5 or 6 people who do evaluate the manuscripts that come in. We do everything by anonymous review. Nobody knows who they're reviewing. Um, so this is a team of volunteers. We've also had some of them have been editors. We edit everything that we publish. We edit with great respect. I'm a writer. I greatly respect other writers, but we take the editing process seriously. Not only editing the work from a literary point of view, but also from a Jewish point of view. There are often, well, I shouldn't say often, regularly, however, there are serious sorts of errors
Mhm.
in terms of Jewish knowledge. So we fix those as well, or we discuss them with the authors as
Mhm.
well. We're now in a time of transition, a very exciting time. I can tell you about that in a moment. But the team now includes, for the first time, a volunteer who has expertise in marketing and publicity. We're certainly in a growth phase, and this person is very experienced and is going to be very helpful to us.
Mhm.
Really, I am working as part of a team. I also have an amazing intern. I've had various interns over the years, and I'm open to interns, having interns. This one is brilliant. And at some point, I'm going to be looking for a managing editor for the journal,
Mhm.
and I have my eye on her as one possibility.
Not you're not ready to put out an announcement.
We don't have the money yet, but when we
Okay.
have the money, we will put out an announcement. Yeah.
Great. We have a question here. Could you please talk about how you determine what defines Jewish fiction? And also a related question, which I have too, is like how Jewish does the story need to be? How much does Judaism need to be woven through the story? Can it just be like a light touch here and there? And I have more questions, but we'll start with that one.
Those are excellent questions. Well, I didn't say anything about the journal, which is relevant for answering this question. We have so far published 37 issues, which comes to 600 works of fiction, either stories or novel excerpts that were either originally written in English or translated into English from 21 languages. So actually, out of the 600, about a third are translations. Um, so that's a lot of stories at this point. And in terms of our criteria, there are really only two, and I'll talk about the Jewish aspect in a sec. The first is just literary excellence. That's really all it comes to. And the second is that it has to be Jewish fiction. So it sounds like an obvious sort of that there would be an obvious answer to the question, what is Jewish fiction? But in fact, this is an extremely contentious and
Mhm.
complicated
Mhm.
issue. There have been literally hundreds of publications and conferences and arguments about what Jewish fiction is. I personally have read over 100 articles and books and so forth about this. And I should say, by the way, that my attitude towards Jewish fiction does not mean that we only publish Jewish authors. We've published non-Jewish authors, so I'll tell you sort of my take on it, and there are hundreds of them. About a couple of months ago, actually, Hadassah magazine approached me and asked me to write an article where I interviewed 7 American Jewish women writers and asked them what did they think makes a novel Jewish.
Mhm.
And in typical fashion, no two agreed. Um, it came out that, if it has a Jewish character, then it's Jewish fiction. If it has a Jewish author, it's Jewish fiction. And then no one agreed. None of the 7 agreed with anybody else. For me, they're really the best definition that I've come across is the one that Ruth Weiss developed for her book, The Modern Jewish Canon. There have been so many, but this is the one that I really think is the best of everything. And she uses the concept of something needing to be centrally Jewish. That is a phrase that Cynthia Ozick developed and that Ruth Weiss took to mean something else. Basically, according to Weiss, for something to be Jewish fiction, it has to reflect Jewish experience, Jewish consciousness, or the Jewish condition. Now, of course, these things are very hard to define. For me, there's a pretty broad uh, kind of spectrum on this. If it reflects the Jewish past, present, or future, culturally, spiritually, certainly not religiously necessarily. For me, there's another element which actually is very helpful because a lot of people talk about this stuff in theoretical terms. But for me, of course, it's not theoretical. When I'm deciding whether or not to accept a story, I have to know whether or not it meets our criteria of Jewish fiction. So it's very important to me and to my whole team that we're very clear about this. So one factor for me is whether or not the Jewish element is inextricable.
Hmm.
So, for example, a lot of people, we get submissions where basically it's a love story. It's a lovely love story. And the woman's name is Rivka, and the boy's name is Moishi, and they're eating, blintzes. If you change the names to Susie and Harry and they were eating pizza, the story would stand completely on its own. It's fine. It misses nothing. So to me, that's not a Jewish story.
Hmm.
If there is something intrinsically Jewish about it, they don't have to be talking about something Jewish. They don't have to be using Yiddish. It's nothing like that. If there is some reflection of Jewish consciousness or experience or identity, that would be enough. So, for example, my most recent book is two novellas, and one is called Yom Kippur in a Gym, and it's set in a gym on Yom Kippur in the last hour of Yom Kippur. And if you take out the Jewish content, there's absolutely nothing left. There's no story.
Mhm.
So that's what we look for, and it's immediately obvious. Sometimes we get really good stories, really interesting stories, and I really want to take it, and there's absolutely no Jewish content. So
Mm.
we don't. But we define it broadly. We're very inclusive. We've published stuff from, and I think the diversity of this journal is actually a very important factor to me. We published authors and content that is on the right and on the left, obviously in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity and everything. We are open to everything, but a story that is really just about, um, love or loneliness, as beautiful as it might be, we're not the right place for that.
That's really interesting. So is there, I imagine it's not so clear cut. So some stories might be like on the spectrum of integrating sort of a Jewish consciousness. So are these kinds of discussions that you have like, okay, there's a Hanukkah scene, but it may as well just be Christmas, or there's a Hanukkah scene, but the way the characters are talking, and there's a grandfather there with the grandfather's history, and that makes it a little bit more of a Jewish story. I'm just wondering because it seems the way you're describing it sounds very clear, but I imagine you get so many stories that are kind of like in a gray area.
We do.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm very inclusive by nature, and this is a very inclusive journal. Sometimes I find myself really fighting for it and saying, well, maybe this is an allegory for Jewish history. It's two people walking down a dark alley. Well,
Mhm.
two people walking down a dark alley is I hope not all of Jewish history anyway. Um, I actually, when I like a story, when our team likes a story, we look and we try. We want the good stories. Um, but if there's nothing there, there's nothing there.
Yeah.
If you have something about someone struggling with something in their life and then they're flashing back 3 or 4 times, to their grandfather, to use your example, who came from Europe and struggled.
Mhm.
And basically, this person is using Jewish history through a personal background to find strength or to find a way to cope. That's a Jewish story.
Mhm.
It's not um, the whole idea of Jewish consciousness is a really interesting thing, and what does it mean?
Mhm.
And um, I don't know. I actually don't like the expression that I'm about to use, but it is that something like, when you see it, it's there. You
Yeah,
do know,
yeah.
and you feel it. And sometimes my team and I just do the exercise of, okay, just take out that paragraph. Does the story manage without it? The
Mhm.
story doesn't need
Mhm.
that Jewish bit. And I actually know authors who have played this game in reverse. I know somebody who wanted to get something published in an American Jewish literary journal many years ago, and she just changed the names and what they were eating, and she got in. And I was really happy for her because I thought that's a nice journal, and that's really nice for her. That's not Jewish fiction. That's just not Jewish fiction. So.
So you have
um,
gefilte fish and the one the one submission, and then it's pizza and all your other.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, she wasn't, I'm not saying she should have been embarrassed, but she didn't even hide it. She was
Yeah.
quite open. She said, this is what I'm doing to get in. And I said, I wish you success.
Mhm.
Oh, we operate differently. We're really a journal that's trying to explore life and existential issues and human reality through a Jewish lens. And,
Mhm.
you know, uh,
And are you open to works where a writer or where a character is sort of turning away from Judaism, where there's some
Absolutely.
kind of like fraught relationship with
Oh,
Judaism?
yes, yes, yes. So many are. For me, engaging is what it's about. These aren't God-fearing,
Mhm.
God-loving people who go to shul. We have almost nobody like that. And remember, of course, a third of these are translations. So what it means to be a Jew in Serbia, I got Serbia on the brain because just yesterday I received an incredibly wonderful story translated from Serbian, which will be in our next
Mhm.
issue at Hanukkah. Um, but life is it's not the same being Jewish in Argentina or
Mhm.
in Greece
Mhm.
or in Israel or in Norway.
Mhm.
So no, I think we really want the full range of what it
Mhm.
is to be Jewish and struggling with being Jewish, or even indifferent to being Jewish. There can be stories where there's almost nothing Jewish, but you understand that this is
Mhm.
someone who grew up, threw it away, and is now trying to live a life that is devoid of Jewish content. So that's a very Jewish story.
Mhm.
That's about struggling with your tradition. And if you're struggling with it, that's a form of engagement.
Mhm.
It means it's important enough to you emotionally, psychologically. It's in your consciousness. It's something that has to be wrestled with, as
Mhm.
opposed to someone for whom it's not even a question.
Mhm.
Questioning is very Jewish, and I love stories that question. And
And we have a question that I'll get to in a second, but I wanted to ask about the fact checking
sure,
component because I had a recent experience. As you know, I shared an essay, and
yeah.
I'll share it with all the readers in the Lit Mag Brag. But it was funny because it was a nonfiction piece and it was about my own experience not knowing Judaism. And I actually made a number of errors in the piece that I caught. And I think no one on the staff actually, they must have not known enough, but I confused a prayer book with the Torah and like all these things that I'm very glad that I caught before the piece was published. But how do you find that you're doing a lot of research into maybe like arcane bits of Jewish history just to make sure that everything's accurate?
Um, I don't think very much about arcane bits of Jewish
Mhm.
history. Occasionally, we had a Romanian story that referenced some politicians. I just wanted to make sure that politician was indeed a historical figure at that time. Um, I know Jewish stuff pretty well,
Mhm.
and I respect writers' desire to be creative with Jewish tradition. So recently, for example, there was something where someone had someone sitting in shul writing notes with a pen and paper. So it was important to this author, and we liked the story. It was a story we were accepting. So, like anything, it's a respectful conversation. It isn't you
Mhm.
did. That's not our approach at all. But we suggested that this person change the context from a shul, from a synagogue to a temple, which is a reform context.
Mm.
Now, I'm not a Reformed Jew, and I don't know if Reformed Jews would sit and actually take notes during a Shabbat service, but it is their attitude towards religious practice is looser and different. I
Mhm.
say that with no disrespect.
Mhm.
Decided that if she uses temple and the person came in with a pen and paper, it wouldn't be the same as walking into an Orthodox shul or a conservative shul. So
Mhm.
that's what we went with. So that's the kind of thing that we would question, because you couldn't have someone taking notes in an Orthodox shul. That's just not going to
Mhm.
happen. Um,
That's so interesting. So was the writer receptive to that suggestion?
yeah, sure. I mean, we're very respectful of writers. It isn't that we come in and it's all marked up and
Mhm.
you made mistakes. That isn't our approach at all. It's very much a discussion, and usually, I mean, almost always, authors are very grateful to us because we improve the work.
Right,
Uh, we
right.
help improve the work.
Hmm. Hmm. So question here, have you published many Israeli writers and any fiction
Yes.
on the Jewish experience since October 7th? So I imagine you're getting a lot
Mhm.
of opinions, responses, and how is that sort of playing out at the magazine?
Yeah. Well, since October 7th, these are all wonderful questions and they're big questions. So I'll just say something brief before answering this more directly. The whole literary landscape has changed since October 7th, 2023. As you mentioned, in fact, in LitMag, there has been a worldwide effort to boycott Israeli writers, Israeli books, Israeli events, Israeli literary events. And this is extended to Jewish writers who are not Israeli. There are publicists who won't deal with Jewish writers and places that will not book Jewish writers. It's a viciously anti-Semitic, frightening time. In that context, our journal seems to be recognized as filling an incredibly important need right now. Unfortunately, I mean, fortunately, it's a safe space for Jewish writers. Um, Out of all the languages we've published, as I said, we've published 20 translations from 21 languages. The one we've published most of is translations from Hebrew. Hebrew is the language that we have published most translations from. I think perhaps close to 100, so 75, 85, 95, 100, somewhere in there. I think in every issue we've published often more than one uh, Israeli translation from Hebrew. We have received quite a few since October 7th, 2023. And in our most recent issue, and I should say, our most recent issue, our current issue, is always available to the public for free. So all of your listeners can go on to our Rosh Hashanah issue, issue 37, and they can read all the stories. And I believe 3 or 4 of them, which I identify in the preface to that issue, are stories about October 7th.
Mhm.
And they're wonderful stories.
Mhm.
Um, I think 4 actually of the stories. Yes. So I should say, related to the accessibility of our journal, we are in a time of transition, and this is relevant because we just a month ago created a new website so that we are no longer just a journal, but we're an educational and cultural resource. Now you can search all 600 stories on themes, for example, by Hanukkah, Bar Mitzvah, Holocaust, feminist, etc., LGBTQ, all sorts of, there are 50 themes. You can search by author, and we publish both very famous authors and authors who people haven't yet heard of, but we've published Elie Wiesel, Aaron Appelfeld, et cetera, many. And you can also search by the language that it was originally written in. So you can read all the Yiddish, you can read all the Russian. We're now in the process of trying to work towards sustainability so that this journal will continue. And so we've begun to charge. You can always read the latest issue, and you can always read a select archive without signing up. But if you want to read all 600 stories and get the full archive, it's $18 a year, which is, $1.50 a month. And this is our sort of our new rate for this initiative, but it's going to be 36 in a few weeks is going to be the real price. So, but anyway, everyone can read these 4 beautiful stories about October 7th.
Mhm. Do you find, have the submissions since October 7th represented a range of viewpoints, or do you find, and are you looking to represent a range of viewpoints, or do you find that there's sort of like a homogeneity in the
Uh,
work?
well, philosophically speaking, ideologically speaking, personally speaking, and those things intersect, of course. I would not publish a story, uh, I don't care if it's written by a Jew or non-Jew, that celebrates the massacre of October 7th. That is a point of view. I won't say legitimate. To me, it's not legitimate, but it's a point of view. So my desire to be inclusive, and I'm very committed to the diversity of this journal. It's actually was one of the founding principles. That does not extend to writing that celebrates murder of Jews, destruction of Israel, or anything along that line. People don't have to be card-carrying Zionists, but I'm not going to publish something that celebrates pain to Jews or hurt to Jews. I won't. So the now it's not that I got those and rejected them. I'm trying to answer you fully. And I didn't turn down anything like that. I didn't receive anything like that. But that is a line that I would draw, of course. So all the ones we received have been about trauma.
Hmm.
One of the 4 that people can read is about a grandmother who flees to the States with her granddaughters. And they miss their parents, their little girls, and they're crying. And she's trying to hold things together.
Mhm.
Another one is about a soldier who returns home and he's shattered, but he has a dog with him that fell in love with him in Gaza and wouldn't stop following him around. And he's brought home the dog from Gaza.
Mhm.
One of them is really stunning, called, I think, The Book of Names, which is a more indirect dealing with the issue. And it includes the names of all the people who were kidnapped at that point,
Mhm.
and murdered at that time. It's dated very specifically, so it doesn't include everybody now. So, and their names translated into English. For instance, if someone's name translates into light, she uses the word light in her story. So it's a
Mhm.
story that encompasses their names.
Mhm.
Um, and the 4th one is also about someone who's been through the war.
Mhm.
So, needless to say, or maybe it's needful to say, but I'll say it anyway, just because there's a story that's about something inherently tragic doesn't mean that the story is solidly gloomy or that all these stories are downers. They have humor, they have life in them. They're beautiful stories, or we wouldn't have taken them.
Would you say that the work is mostly character driven, or do you also look for kind of experimental work?
We welcome everything. I,
Mhm.
I don't know. I don't know about looking for. I mean, we're just flooded all the time with
Mhm.
submission. I don't really look for anything. Um, we welcome experimental.
Mhm.
Uh, obviously, we've published stories that have had almost no plot. They're so internal.
Mhm.
Can be a problem, but in a good story, it's not a problem. We've had stories that are a little thin on character development,
Mhm.
but somehow worked, you know. So I don't have, we as a team don't have a set of rules. Um, you know, we need 25% this and 25% that. It isn't. There's a huge variability of style, of attitude,
Mhm.
of theme. Those 50 themes that people can search on our website now are just a fraction of the themes. We actually went through hundreds of themes, and those are the ones that seemed most prominent, but that will, you know, that will also develop over time.
Mhm. How many
Mm.
submissions do you get per reading period?
But we don't have a reading period.
Oh.
There's, we're always open. Gee, I don't know, in the
Mm.
hundreds,
Mhm.
all the, I always have, I've learned to not feel pressured by it. We always have a list of stories that are not yet read that have to be read by my reviewers. One reviewer will read 10 a month, one will read three a month. So I'm always sort of behind. Um, they write qualitative evaluations on each story and they give it a number. So if two people pan a story, I don't even read it. If two people recommend it, I read it. And if one of the two recommends it, I read it. And sometimes it even goes to a third person if there's, to break the tie or whatever. Um, and it's very interesting because my reviewers, they're amazing people, every single one, and I really respect them. So if one person gives it a 9 and one person gives it a 2, I take that very seriously. I don't think, oh, the number 2 is lazy or number 9 is too easy. They're all really smart and committed people very thoughtful people. So I get to break the tie as the editor in chief. I get to make the decision. Um, and sometimes it's hard. Sometimes I'll hold on to a story for a few weeks. Um, and then sometimes I'll know it's not a really great story, but I just am not willing to turn it down. And then I go,
Mhm.
well, then what is it that's holding you there? What is it that's so compelling? And
Mhm.
then I figure it out and I accept it. Or I say, well, there is a compelling piece, but it's so badly written. When I'm reading a story that we receive, I didn't initially, but for years now, I read with a pen in my hand, at least to know how much of an editing job this is going to be.
Mhm.
You know, I certainly don't look at this as a free creative writing course for the
Mhm.
writers. Although my background's in social work, so I certainly, I have a desire to help sort of thing. And we've published lots of people for the first time who are now having good careers. And, that's a special bond between me and them. Um, but sometimes it's just a really good story and it's going to take a ton of editing work. And it's interesting, my intern and I talk about these things in detail and because she's trying to learn. And in the past, I'd say up until about a year ago, I would take it because there's just something really good about it. And now I'm just not willing to spend hours and hours and hours fixing a story. I mean, and I'm also not willing to start the process of get it edited and send it back because that's a commitment already to reconsider it. But I would say, generally speaking, we're a generous journal. I mean, to this day, I mean, if I have really 30 corrections on page one, I mean, serious corrections,
Mhm.
serious grammar, three sentences that make no sense, I probably wouldn't find it a really compelling, good story anyway. But if there's something that really holds me, now and again, I'll say, okay, I'll help this person. This
Mhm.
person has something as a writer, and it's not a 20-page story. I can do this. And
Mhm.
occasionally I'll do that. But, you know, we're not a free editing service.
Yeah.
So
How do
there's a
you handle those stories? I imagine you get a fair number of these that might not meet the literary excellence criteria, but you know that this is a writer who has a story to tell. Maybe they've lived through something personally. Maybe they're an older. I'm saying this because I used to consult, and I would just see manuscripts all the time, and I would see something where I could tell the skill wasn't exceptionally high, but I could tell that the writer had been through something, and they were. It was a story I wanted out in the world, but it wasn't necessarily
Ready.
beautifully written.
Right.
And how do you handle works like that?
Well, those are the kinds of ones I struggle over,
Hmm.
you know. Um, I'm not anymore really at the point where I mean, I very much want to encourage new writers, and that was really the purpose of the journal in the first place. I mean, it wasn't to publish Elie Wiesel, it was to make a space for people who couldn't get published. So now we have those two populations. We have, and we publish writers who initially weren't well known, but now are. So um, if something isn't, it's not good as a story. I mean, it has the kernel of an idea. That's not something I'm going to take on. I'm not going to accept it and help them develop the story. What I'm referring to more is someone who, reuses the same word 10 times in the
Hmm.
story,
Hmm.
who consistently makes the same grammatical mistake, has two sentences that aren't really clear. Um, and this happens not that often, but also I would say regularly, where the story is ended at the wrong point. You
Hmm.
know, it'll be a fabulous story, and then there's this useless paragraph at the end,
Hmm.
um, where, you know, I wouldn't say I'll take your story if you cut the last paragraph, but when we're in the editing process,
Hmm.
you know, I and three other people on my team think this is a much stronger story without this thing.
Hmm.
And, many writers, and again, I'm a writer, so I understand this. The first response is no, that's how it has to be. And I ask them to sit with it, and almost always, not because I make it a condition of publication, I don't do that, but because they think about it, and they'll go, yeah, it really should end here.
Hmm.
It's so much more powerful.
Hmm.
So that's the kind of thing I'll do. But something that's, got the germ of a good story, that's not something
Hmm.
I can really deal with.
Hmm. Question here. Have you published stories about the Hasidic community in this country or elsewhere, stories written by current or former members of the community?
Yes. Yes, we have. I can't rattle off the names by heart. Um, there are, you know, stories that I don't know, they don't necessarily define themselves as Hasidic, but it's obvious that it's the Hasidic community from things that are described in the story. There are also, there's a whole range of religious observance. So, for example, I'm thinking about a story now called Hold Tight. We send out a story a week to our subscribers and a story once a month to our general mailing list. And Hold Tight was in one of those categories recently. And it's a recent story. I think it's either in the current issue or the one just before, either a Rosh Hashanah or Pesach issue, which is about a wonderful story about a young woman who's engaged to be married to a man whom she loves and who loves her. I'm not going to say but, and he observes Shomer Negia. He doesn't touch before marriage. I mean, not hold hands. I'm not talking about sexual intercourse. They don't hold hands. And how she struggles with that. And for her birthday, she chooses to take three girlfriends to go pole dancing. She used to love pole dancing. Um, so it's marvelous in capturing the
Hmm.
complexity of the religious life. I would say one of the things, I'm so happy you're to have this conversation, Becky, and I really appreciate the very thoughtful and nuanced questions you're
Hmm.
asking and the your audience is asking. One of the things that really bothers me in the real world and in fiction, but I'm talking now about the real world, so to speak, real world, is is the stereotypes about Jews and including subgroups of Jews, the way a secular Jew will look at a religious Jew, as an Orthodox Jew or a Hasidic Jew. They're so different, they're so weird. Or how they might look at a secular Jew or a Reformed Jew. Or I just hate this. I mean, we have enough external detractors. We shouldn't be doing this to ourselves. I also see this journal because it is so diverse, and it's welcomed by the translation community and the world literature community. It's not just Jews reading this, obviously. It's really important to me that the diversity of Jewish experience and Jewish life be made public, because part of what anti-Semitism is about is inaccurate perceptions of Jews. It's only part of what it's about, but all Jews are white, which we're not. All Jews are rich or richer, we are not, etc., etc. And you can't read these stories without understanding the incredible diversity and complexity of Jewish experience, which includes vulnerability, obviously, and subtlety. Um, I published a story early on in the life of the journal from someone who lives in a settlement in Israel, which is not my orientation politically, but it was a very good story. And I took it, and it was a matter of principle for me to take it. This isn't about my points of view. This is about the full range of Jewish life around the world. It's not just North American. It's making space you know, for Spanish and, for everything. And not just Ashkenazi and not just heterosexual and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Very, very important to me. And actually, I've heard from Jews and non-Jews alike that this journal has surprised them. The phrase, I didn't know that, blah, 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 blah. Um, Nothing would make me happier than readers discovering, then when readers do discover, because it happens all the time, something different, where suddenly their understanding of what it is to be Jewish broadens and deepens. And it's, oh, wow, I never thought about that. And I think fiction has a very special power because when you read fiction, your inner defenses drop and you let inside you the characters that you're reading about. In fact, there's real life research showing that people who read good fiction, literary fiction, are actually changed in real life, not just attitudinally, but behaviorally. They become more empathic. I'm familiar with this psychological literature, which isn't the reason to write Jewish fiction at all, or to read fiction. It's just such a pleasure. But it's got a lot of power. And I would really love to see this power harnessed for the good of the Jewish community and the world at large. I would love there to be much more mutual understanding between us and other groups and other cultures. I read translations from, I don't know, dozens and dozens and dozens of languages and cultures, and I love it and I find it fascinating. And I was at a book club not that long ago talking about 18, the book 18. And a woman put up her hand and said, but why would a non-Jew want to read about us? Which I found so incredibly sad. So incredibly sad. I wasn't judgmental. I just almost wanted to cry. And I said to her, but what do you read? I said, I read translations from Greek and Chinese and Spanish and Japanese and Hindi, various Indian dialects. And she goes, oh, me too. And I said, so what does it say? What are you saying? That our culture isn't as beautiful, our literature isn't as valid? Why? Why would you think that? And she went, oh my God. And the whole room went, oh my, like there's this internalized sense of if it's Jewish, it's not of interest to other or whatever. I think there's anti-Semitism has reached its fingers into all sorts of places. But um, and for example, I'm very honored that last year the Pushcart Prize took one of our stories, the So, I mean, that's an example of how Jewish fiction is just part of the world.
Mhm. Do you think, I guess I'm sort of asking this with your writer hat on, do you think that it's hard to place Jewish themed work in literary magazines? And as I'm thinking of the question, I also acknowledge that I think generally it might be hard to place religious oriented work at all because in the literary magazines that I read, I don't see, it's just not part of the like Jewish, Catholic, Episcopalian, like it's not, I don't see many stories kind of grappling with any religious identity.
Most of our stories don't. I can't, I
Mm,
don't even, I could count them on one hand,
hmm
actually, that
mm,
are dealing with, I should go to shul more, or why don't I go to shul? That's not what these stories are like or
mm,
about or anything like that.
mm,
I don't know where religious Jewish stories would be played. I mean, there are religious magazines and there are Jewish magazines. Um, as I alluded to before, and I really don't want to make our conversation in a big way about this, but the literary landscape for Jewish writing is not what it was a year ago. There
mm,
is real vicious anti-Semitism in the literary world now. For example, I'm sure many of your listeners have heard of Sally Rooney, the Sally Rooney's petition that she spearheaded to boycott Israeli books and events and so forth. There are literary journals that I know of where the submission page says required for submitting to us is affirming your um, commitment to stand with the Palestinian people and to condemn the Zionist entity.
mm,
So, obviously Jews have all sorts of attitudes, different attitudes about Israel, to which they're entitled. But there are many Jews who are not only unable to submit or unwilling to submit to those places, but are profoundly hurt by that kind of requirement. I heard recently about a publicist who asks all of her clients, a, a, a literary publicist, is it okay if I submit your work for reviews and for various publicity events to places that have not yet condemned Israel? The person who told me this said, you know, totally send it to those places. I think it's disgusting that people, that kind of uh, question even comes up. Like, why? Anyway, so it's a really terrible time for Jewish writers, is what I'm saying. I personally am not suffering. I had a year ago, 18 came out, and I don't know, on March 1st, my two novellas came out, In Sickness and in Health, Yom Kippur in a Gym. And my publisher has already committed to my next novella and to another book the year after. So I'm not speaking from a point of view of poor me. But I must say, it's a terrible, terrible, terrible time for Jewish writers. And it's not just the literary world, as we know, it's all the arts, it's the academe. The, it's naive to say or to think that anti-Israelism, which is different from legitimate critique of Israel, those are two different phenomena, that anti-Israelism is not going to have an impact on Jews, whatever their beliefs about Israel.
mm,
In fact, my first novel, called Fields of Exile, explores the experience of a Jewish student. This was set in 2002, but published in 2014. Her experience, she's a left-wing Zionist, loves Israel, spent her life working with bringing about coexistence between Jews and Palestinians in Israel. She comes back to Canada for a year to study, and she is just completely persecuted. It's the first and only novel about anti-Israelism on campus, actually, um, called Fields of Exile. So that whole question of what is legitimate critique, what is not legitimate critique, what is anti-Semitism, where do you draw the line, all this stuff is something I'm very uh, conversant with. And I also, in my former life as a professor, did a national study of anti-Semitism in Canada, comparing it with sexism in the same population. So I'm not going to go into this further right now, but just to say, if we're talking about the context of this literary journal, Jewish fiction, nothing about the world, the literary world is normal now.
Mhm.
And I regularly get emails saying, thank God you exist, because I have nowhere else that feels safe right now.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I'm happy to be a safe place for Jewish writers,
Mhm.
whatever their beliefs.
Are you thinking of putting out some kind of statement, or how do you see the magazine responding? So the question here is that there's a magazine, Room Magazine, also in Canada, put out a statement that they're participating in the boycott of the cultural boycott of Israel. So are you considering some kind of public counter statement, or is your magazine's very existence its own kind of statement, or how do you see the role of your magazine in this context?
That's a very good question. It's something I've been thinking a lot about. There was a counter letter to Sally Rooney, which of course I signed, the one that's boycotting Israeli writers. I circulated it widely among people I know. Um, as for taking a public stance, after Fields of Exile was published, my novel, I was targeted by an anti-Israel group in the United States on Twitter. They had over 1 million followers, and there were death threats made against me. At the time, I had a child. I have a child. It was a very scary experience. So I have decided not to make the journal a public face for the anti-Israel,
Mhm.
as a way to take on the anti-Israel fight. I talk about the that experience on Twitter not because it made me unwilling to do things, but it's made me think about different ways to fight. I am an activist by nature. I founded or co-founded 3 Canadian Zionist organizations, all left-wing, progressive, critical, but Zionist-loving, Israel-loving organizations. I have the nature of an activist, and I still do. And I'm doing all sorts of things behind the scenes to do what I can. But I'm also not willing at this point to spend 5 or 6 hours a day fighting with people on Facebook.
Mhm.
I don't think that's the most effective kind of strategy. Never mind my time. I don't think that's where I want to do this. And I also think it's complicated because the journal, I mean, at some level, it's my journal. I founded it and I lead it. But the authors I publish have all sorts of different points of view. I I don't, I suppose I can speak for the journal without speaking for the authors. I don't see the journal being a leader in this fight, at least not yet. But I am doing lots and lots of stuff that in other arenas.
Mhm. And this is maybe too broad of a question for the, the scope of this interview, but I know people will want me to sort of touch on this. How do you respond when people are saying, well, this is a specific boycott against Israeli institutions? It's not about anti-Semitism. It's not about boycotting Jewish writers. It's a boycott against this particular place and the institutions and the funding of the war. And this might be
Well,
too broad. I usually don't get into these kinds of topics in these interviews, so
not
this
too broad. It's an
is
ex. I have colleagues and people I know and uh, who believe that Israel is a settler, colonial, etc. And believe they're committing genocide, and they're not, and I can refute those arguments by the numbers. I can define genocide, and the Palestinian people are 5 times the size that they were in 1948, and this is not anyway, whatever. I'm not going to do this here. Um, and I will also say that it can't be a colonial state because a colony has to have a mothership, and the people who founded modern Israel were refugees from countries they were fleeing because of anti-Semitism. And it's not colonial because we were there as of 2,000 years ago, and it was our home from which we were expelled, and now we are returning to our home. But anyway, I won't do more than that right now. The question really asks, where is the line? How do you define the difference between anti-Israelism and anti-Semitism? What do those things mean? The There is what is now known as sort of the old anti-Semitism, which was directed at individuals. Individuals were seen as embodying the evil in the world. Jews were evil. And there was a whole weird thing about anti-Semitism is that the Jews are too intellectual, but they're too sensual, they're too rich, but they're too poor. There are all these impossible kinds of beliefs about Jews. What has happened in the current form of anti-Semitism, which characterizes the far left, the extreme left. I've considered myself on the left my whole life, but now I can't really use that term. I'd say I'm progressive, politically progressive, certainly left of center, but the left now being anti-Israel as part of its platform, I can't be part of that, or I'm not part of that. But what's nicknamed the new anti-Semitism, although it's already decades old, really sees the Jewish activity, the embodiment of evil. The Jewish collectivity being Israel, which is the evil of the world. And if you eradicate it, the world will be cleaner and better and devoid of evil and filth and so forth. It even hurts to say these things. But anyway, I'm saying them because the way in which Israel is regarded and treated is not applied to any other country or people, regardless of the fact that the human rights records of those countries, the dictatorships, the treatment of their own people and other peoples is abysmal. Israel is repeatedly singled out for different and discriminatory judgments. So I think it is in some cases, people really don't understand the difference between anti-Israelism and anti-Semitism. And there are people who genuinely are critical of Israel who aren't anti-Semites, obviously. But what I found in my research and of my studying this for years is that when you, this is something I've done, engage in conversation with somebody who thinks that Israel has no right to exist, that it is an evil state that must be destroyed, and you talk to them for longer than a couple of minutes. And this has nothing to do with the government is corrupt, the government of Israel is no good. I personally don't care for the government of Israel right now, but that's neither here nor there. When you scratch the surface, they use all of the tropes about Israel that characterize classic anti-Semitism. The Jews, Israel, controls the banks, it controls the economy of the world. And they're all rich and they have superpower and they want to destroy everyone who's not Jewish. It's all the classic tropes of anti-Semitism from the Middle Ages and beyond. And there's no way to not hear what they're saying. It's really about you have to destroy Jews and you have to destroy the Jewish state. So once you're dealing with that, you know what you're dealing with. And again, unfortunately, I mean, I've spent years in dialogue groups, Jewish Palestinian dialogue groups that were wonderful experiences. I have Palestinian colleagues for whom I have the greatest respect. So that please don't misunderstand anything I'm saying. But when you're dealing with real anti-Israelism as opposed to legitimate critique of Israel, which I engage in all the time, I have to say, Netanyahu is, we won't talk about Netanyahu right now. Um, but real anti-Israelism, which views Israel as an evil entity that must be wiped out for the good of the world, that's an anti-Semitic sentiment.
Mhm. Okay, so I'm going to bring the conversation back to
The journal, I hate that topic, but
the
I
writer.
felt, no, I really hate talking about this stuff. It's so
Yeah,
painful,
yeah,
but,
it's
and it's so
painful.
awful, but someone asked a question and I figured
Hmm.
they deserve
Hmm.
an answer. So
Sure, sure. Thank you for it. How often does your journal come out? And in terms of guidelines, do you have a word limit and do you pay writers?
mhm. We at present come out 3 times a year, but that may increase. Um, we're thinking of presently we come out at Pesach, Rosh Hashanah, and Hanukkah, which means basically spring, fall, winter. And we may be doing this more often. We always have 2 or 3 issues ready to go ahead of
Hmm.
time. So we may
Hmm.
be doing that. We're not able to pay writers because we have no money at all.
Hmm.
We don't have, none of us get paid. The only person who gets paid once every 5 years or so is the lawyer for the journal. If there's any kind of, there is no money. I
Hmm.
think writers should be paid. I'm a writer. I would love to be paid
Hmm.
for my, and when we have money, that's something we will take up, of course.
Hmm.
And there was another, you asked 3 questions. I think I've answered just 2 of them.
Word limit.
Ah, uh, generally 1,500 to 6,000 words, but there's some flexibility. Like you can go a bit over. We don't publish flash fiction. We get tons of that.
Hmm.
And we see clearly on our submissions page that we do not publish flash fiction.
Hmm.
It's fun. I mean, it's good, but that's not what we do.
Hmm. Well, we're just about out of time. I want to thank you, Nora. This has been really incredible, and it's such a pleasure to speak with you and hear all about this magazine. And thank you so much for sharing some of these more fraught your views on these issues with us. One final question I ask this of all editors, and particularly for you now, like what keeps you doing this work? What keeps you motivated? What keeps you inspired? Especially if it's a volunteer project and there are a lot of, opposing forces that you're dealing with right now. What keeps you editing this magazine?
Well, I just love it. I mean, so many reasons not to do it. I mean, there are only so many hours in the day. It comes off my writing time, obviously. I love the work we get. One of the gifts of this journal, which was completely unexpected, is that I'm now part of an international multilingual community of writers, publishers. Um, I had, for example, we accepted a story translated from German, and I got this joyful email from a publisher in Germany, not a Jewish publisher, publishing house or Jewish publisher, just saying, "Oh my gosh, we got into Jewish fiction," you know, and it just gives me such joy. I'm meeting these wonderful people. I'm reading amazing literature, and it's literature, especially the translations, that isn't really available anywhere. If you were even if you knew that there was Albanian Jewish literature and you Googled it, there's no way to get hold of it in English. So the idea that not only am I finding these things and loving reading them, but I'm able to share them and give them a place in the world, make them accessible to people.
Mhm.
That's such a source of joy for me.
Mhm.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This has been really great. Thank you, everybody, for coming out, and we will see you very soon.
Thank you, Becky. It's really been a pleasure.